Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book. And this week we have a cute little book. It's very small. Dream It to Do It. The Science and the Magic. And take a wild guess what it talks about. It talks about dreams and the association between reality, consciousness, and the dream state. This is called Decoding Reality 2.0. And it's called that because it's actually an update of a book. Oh, I didn't tell you the name of the author. Dr. Howard Eisenberg. Cool cover. Like that. So Dr. Eisenberg wrote this actually in 1977, and it was updated in 2021 to keep up with new discoveries, new schools of thought, and current events. So it starts with a section called Inner Spaces, Parapsychological Exploration of Minds. And the introduction, the author explains that he felt called to update his book because of the times, dark times, he says, with multiple existential threats. And he has always explored in his professional life and his personal life how reality works. He calls himself a psychonaut. It's about himself personally exploring altered states of consciousness. So he knows of which he speaks. He's not just an impartial scientific researcher here. He believes there is a plasticity to conventional reality. So reality is actually more malleable than we think it is. It's not as three-dimensional, rigid, following a certain set of rules as we've been led to believe. This book, he says, is just a continued deep dive from its original form. He says there is a world behind our world, and that is our true nature. And there are magical resources that are our birthright that we've forgotten. And we live in a technology-dependent world, and we've sort of set aside those other abilities. Now, from other books, this is not in this book specifically at this point, but he's making reference to what many sources of wisdom, let's put it that way, old information, ET information, what people have received in dreams, what people have learned from past life regressions, every imaginable resource. There is a lot of information that has been given to us about our forgetting or losing skills that are still available to us. We just have forgotten. So I'm talking about things like clairvoyance, telepathy, telekinesis, etc., etc. So this book requires anyone who's reading it to think deeply and to expand your consciousness. So I kind of assume if you're listening to this, you're pretty open-minded. So get ready, because this will require that. And he quotes then from the Oracle at Delphi, Know Thyself. He quotes from the Bible, from Matthew, Seek and you shall find. Chapter 1, Things are not as they seem. So we're programmed by our experiences in this 3D world to see reality through a different lens. And our beliefs will determine the lens or lenses that we view the world out of. Religion, culture, politics, prejudice, ideologies, and life events, traumas, experiences, relationships. Each of those things will act as a filter and create the lens that through which we interpret our reality. It blinds us to the views and experiences of other people. To challenge these filters, to take the film away from our eyes, they limit us. This is a voyage of self-discovery, and we really can free ourselves from restrictions. Restrictions we probably don't even know exist. But it takes courage to question your own truths, and it's really scary to question your own reality. Prevailing mainstream science says that you are a meat machine. In other words, a functioning machine made out of meat. That your sense of self is an illusion created by your brain, and that the universe in general is meaningless. It's kind of a nihilistic viewpoint. So what if reality is not fixed? What you see is what you get. Many religions believe that we're actually all asleep and that we don't realize it right now, right this second we're dreaming. And our ego keeps us trapped in this illusory world. So he makes a huge point of it, so I wrote it in capital letters. Things are not as they seem. And now he explains the science of that, according to physics. Solids, that state of matter, solid objects are mostly empty space. But we can see and touch and sense them despite that, and despite the fact that their reality is actually pretty amorphous, pretty ghostly. But it's our perception that makes us see something solid. It's really a collection of molecules being held together, and there's more empty space there than there is actually molecules. So our perception challenges our reality, changes how each of us sees reality. And he gives the example of that trick in karate where you chop the board with your bare hand. And the trick that they do is they teach them, because martial arts, I guess martial arts really is more closely related to metaphysics than it is to sports, than they are to sports. Martial arts require a particular mindset, a particular awareness of your consciousness and our place in reality. And when they do the karate chop, these kids are not just taught to be strong and to do it, the mechanics of it. They're taught to think, to use their mind, to think about going through to the other side of the board. Pretty good. Then there's the whole walking on hot coals thing where you don't burn your feet because you believe you won't burn your feet. Still, if you've ever had a bad burn from anything, you might think twice about that unless you're very good about controlling your consciousness. Perception is not based on the objective external world, despite how real it seems. Our behavior is restricted by our emotional attachments and our fear. Buddha knew this. He said, let go of your limiting beliefs. They cause unnecessary suffering. And somebody who, this is actually not somebody, it's a thing. It's an Asian form of yoga. And I'm going to say it wrong, but I'm sorry. Qigong yoga. It's thousands of years old, and practitioners learn to project their internal vital energy outward, called the Shen. And they can heal with this. Also defend themselves with it. Another example is Sistema, and I've heard of this. This is weird. This is a Russian form of martial arts that uses your head, uses your mind. It's a hybrid of Cossack and Asian martial arts, and it's used by the Russian Special Forces. It's serious stuff. And an advanced, well, I wrote advanced guide, but I'm sure they said an advanced expert in the field, Colonel Mikhail Ryabko, has seen it impacting people. In fact, he himself has been able to use it to impact people with his mind, people who are feet away. And in both these things, Sistema and the yoga I can't pronounce, they use your mind to project an outward influence. And it's because of the plasticity of conventional physical reality. This is a manipulation of the energy that's part of us and that's around us and that's contained within everything. I know this sounds like I'm a broken record, and I am, but go back and listen to the videos I made on the new science of heaven about plasma physics, because this is what we're talking about. These people develop the ability to manifest energy and direct it for an effect on the outside world. Then there's the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS, which I spoke about on Debbie Freebird Spirit's channel Wednesday. We had a conversation, and it was really, really fun. And we ended up talking almost exclusively about UFO and ET experiences and answered some questions from people. And, you know, email me at gmail.com. And I don't know my own email. And if you have questions about ETs and UFOs, and we're going to do another video soon to sort of address people's curiosity, and I'll recommend books. In the meantime, I did mention this on this video with Debbie. Edgar Mitchell started this institute, and this is documented what he talks about. They have shown that talented subjects, now these are people who learn how to do this, talented subjects are able to evoke measurable effects on physical and the physical world and on electronically shielded technology devices. And they do it with imagining in their heads. We have a quote here. The situation the Earth is in today has been created by unmindful production and unmindful consumption. We consume to forget our worries and our anxieties. Tranquilizing ourselves with overconsumption is not the way. And this is from Thich Nhat Hanh. And I don't know who that is, but I agree. Okay. The egoic self, your ego, who you think you are because, you know, you're so great. This is a delusion, and it hijacks our emotions, our emotional mind, and it gets us to behave at the expense of other people for the service of ourselves. It always needs external rewards, and it needs external validation, and it will dehumanize others to the advantage of ourselves. This is something we fight against, I hope. It creates us versus them tribalism. This is what they appeal to when they rally around a MAGA flag, for example. Or a sports team. This dehumanizes others and leads to conflict seeking. And it leads to exploitation and pollution of the planet because there's a disregard for anything that doesn't serve the self. Enlightened behavior. Now, this is all coming from research from Dr. Edgar Mitchell, a remarkable person. Enlightened behavior feels a connection with others, with everyone. It feels compassion and seeks out collaboration. And ironically, this kind of behavior is quite self-serving. It's the best kind of behavior. It's the best protection against things like the excessive stresses of life. Altruistic ego and awareness and compassion for others are really quite self-serving in their end result. But their motivation is not self-serving. It's concern for others. The higher your connection to others, and that doesn't necessarily mean how many friends you have in your address book. The higher your connection on an emotional, spiritual, psychological level with others, the more you feel connected to the people of the planet, the greater your happiness. And this has been measurable in studies that they've done at the Noetic Institute. Most cultures have an Eden myth, as we know from Paul Wallace's book. And it describes a period of harmony and then a fall, and we lose connection to the spirit at that fall, and we begin to believe our well-being depends on external natural resources. And this is a narrative that occurs everywhere, every culture. The meaningfulness of life is given over to consumerism. Nature is harmonious and spiritual, but it became an exploited commodity over time. If people see how we're all interconnected and connected with nature, we would not have an environmental crisis and we wouldn't have wars all over the world. This is Stanley Krippner, who wrote the introduction to the book too, which I summarized. You didn't even know it. So, Indigenous and Aboriginal people are closer to this truth. They've had less interference to divide them from this truth, just because. And they knew the importance of honoring nature and all life on earth, animals and plants. For example, the Iroquois, they had the Great Law, the principle of 7 generations. Anything you do, think ahead 7 generations and make your actions sustain the future into the next 7 generations. The Native American tribes of the Great Lakes areas, what did they call themselves? The 5 ethical people or something, I don't know. We read about this a long, long time ago. And I do believe the Iroquois were part of this coalition. They had a very advanced spiritual system that the framers of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the founders of the American government actually shared their interest with the larger Enlightenment movement. And the men of that time, who are credited with having great thoughts, borrowed a lot of them from the Native Americans. This was not an idea, this thing that all people are created equal and we're brothers and we share. This was not a naturally occurring attitude. It had been kind of worked out, beaten out of European culture. And it was discovered that these native people that they did not really understand had these great ideas. So the abandonment of these values and the predatory, exploitative mindset that came with the expansion of white settlements in the New World, Australia, have led to our present existential crisis. And it's critical that we wake up. This book is sort of dedicated to that idea. For example, the World Health Organization has discovered that depression is the leading cause of disability in the world. For example, this is the data from the World Health Organization and the UN. So I am not promoting any one set of facts or beliefs. I'm simply relating the data, draw your own conclusions. In 2018, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, estimated that we have 12 years to the year 2030 to limit global catastrophe. And this is what they came out and printed in their presentation. And then there's the doomsday clock. I always thought that was just sinister. It reflects multiple existential threats, and it tells us the time on a clock, an analog clock with the 12 at the top, being midnight, how many moments we are to midnight, which is chaos, catastrophe. In 2021, we had 100 seconds left. We were 100 seconds to midnight. So we're the first species to face extinction by our own acts and to be aware of that. In 2019, Greta Thunberg made a speech at the UN Refugee Agency, and she said, "No one is safe until everyone is safe." Now that's not a new notion. As long as one person suffers, we all suffer. Loneliness is increasing these days despite our high-tech connections because technology is horizontal and not deep. I would argue that in the community on YouTube of people like you and me who interconnect through these channels, and there are many wonderful people who are discussing ideas of spirituality and connectedness and a sense of responsibility to each other and service to others, etc., etc. Those channels are unique because they're not full of vituperation and anger and hostility and criticism and negativity. There's much elevating other people and encouraging and reassurance, and there's a true connection. And I don't believe that I'm, imagining that. I feel like there's a very strong connection between people like you guys and, all those characters that I hang out with. And we who have channels have connected on a meaningful level, and I do feel it's meaningful. I don't get the feeling that it's done purely for self-advantage or self-promotion. There is an awful lot of sorority for the most part. Sorry, Gerald. There's a lot of connection, and I think it's a beautiful thing, and I think it is sort of the exception that proves this rule, because if you go just about anywhere else in social media, it's so hostile, it's so divisive, it's so angry. People trying to prove they're right, and not listening to each other and getting nasty. And this increases loneliness. It increases the sense of isolation. Every time you go on Facebook, and I don't do that, but I hear, every time you go on Facebook and you get a negative response to something, it makes you feel alone, and that's not healthy. So we have a choice. We can choose how we interact and if we interact, and it's possible for us to be, as he calls it, dreamers of the dream, capital letters. And he says we can be intentionally generating new and more desirable experiences by transforming our personal dreams. And he literally means like when you go to bed and you go to sleep and you dream, but also your conscious hopes and dreams, aspirations. So now we're on chapter 2, the only thing that you can absolutely know. So can you prove you're not dreaming right now? Start thinking about that too long and you start to get kind of confused. The butterfly dream. Once upon a time I dreamed I was flying as a butterfly. However, soon I awakened and was my familiar self again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a man. This is from Master Chuangzi, 4th century BC, Chinese Taoist philosopher. Tao is the way. And from John, Bible, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So nobody can prove that we're not dreaming. We can't, So there's no certainty about any of this. There's no certainty about our shared external reality. The Vedantic philosophers of India, the ones who studied the Vedas, call this Maya, the misinterpretation of illusion. Everything is an illusion and we misinterpret it as reality. And he cites the parable of the blind men and the elephant. All these men who cannot see experience for the first time an elephant by touching parts of the elephant. Well, one of them touches the trunk, one of them touches the tail. One gets a leg, one gets a side, one gets the belly, so one gets the ear. And their understanding of an elephant is limited to their experience of that particular body part. They don't see the holistic whole. So we assume that others are experiencing, seeing as we do, and understand as we do. I often thought of that as a child. How do we know that everybody sees red the same way? We've all been conditioned to look at the color red and call it red. But how do we know what other people are seeing when they say red? We'll all look at something and we'll all agree it's red, but is your red? Are you seeing what I'm seeing when I say red? We're both seeing what we always call red. We're both looking at what we've agreed to call red. But are we really seeing the same thing? Think about that a minute. Then you're going to get a pain right here in your third eye. Anyway, then there's Plato's allegory of the cave, and I had to get Allie of Heart and Soul Connected to really explain this to me. It's never made sense to me, and now it does. So I'm going to try to explain it to you, and this should be pretty funny. So it's all about these prisoners that are in a dark cave, and the only thing they ever see are reflected shadows. They never see the reality. They just see the shadows of the reality outside. One escapes, and he does see the reality, the truth. And he returns to the cave, but he's blinded by the dark that he returns to. And the others dismiss him as handicapped by the dark, by being blind, that his escape in some way blinded him. So they're too fearful to trust him and go out with him and to see the reality, and they stay the prisoners of their fear and their false beliefs. So she cleared it up for me. Descartes wrote cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And he can't doubt that he's doubting, is what that's all about. I have my heat on because it's freezing and I'm starting to get too warm. It's ridiculous. Anyway, I think therefore I am. I better not doubt, because in my thinking it proves that I really am what I am, and then you get into this loop of, oh my God. So we can 100% know that we have an awareness of being aware, and that we dream. And is it really a dream? Is it reality? Is it altered consciousness or not? We don't know. The knower cannot know himself is the lesson here. We can't be both the observer and the subject of observation. A good way to understand this concept is your eyeball cannot see itself. So we can only be certain of our personal conscious awareness. We can be certain that we are experiencing. Consider then at least the theoretical possibility that you've actually been living in a mind-generated, all-embracing, collective illusion ever since your earliest childhood. Most people think we believe our experience. This is not true. We experience what we believe. So now we're going to get into a deeper scientific explanation of proof that we're experiencing what we believe, and that what we expect is going to inform what we see. Chapter 3, the real basis of scientific discovery and invention. So, about science, this is what he says now. I want to be very careful with YouTube. I'm not advocating anti-science. I'm quoting from the book about this philosophical point of view, that science pretends to be something different from what it really is. It pretends to be something different from what it really is, and because it has been accorded widespread and uncritical adherence, one longs for a new enlightenment to puncture the pretensions of this latest superstition. This is Austin Hughes, biologist, in the New Atlantis, 2012. And then from Einstein, imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world. The more I learn about Einstein, the more interesting of an individual he seems to me. In my entire life, I kind of thought of him as a physics nerd, and that was unappealing, and I paid very little attention. But his mind actually went some very interesting places. Where are we here? So science examines the external objective thing, but as physics has grown, as in understanding, the external material reality has lost substance. So that goes back to that explanation that most solid matter is actually mostly empty space. That's a truism of physics. Chapter 3, the real basis of scientific... Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped a page here. I skipped a paragraph here. I went back up a paragraph. Pre-science, Christian and Western, early Christian and Western believed that the earth was the center of the universe and that everything else that was said about it was heresy. So it just shows you that science has to reevaluate often because they you know, not exactly always 100% correct. Galileo in 1633, for example, was tried and convicted by the Inquisition for saying otherwise, for saying that the earth was not the center of the solar system. And his critics refused to look through his telescope for him to prove his point. So their understanding of the earth and reality was based on faith and religion as the only truth. So according to the author, and I'm being really careful here because I'm still on probation, and there's a law on YouTube about promoting misinformation and disinformation about things like science. And I want to be really careful that we're discussing theories, philosophical approaches, and these are the words of the author of this book. I'm not promoting this as truth or not truth. The author says that scientific materialism, that's very rooted in the three-dimensional world, plays the same role today as the faith and superstition of the Inquisition played in the past. This unquestioned assumption that science is the only truthful way to gain knowledge about reality, and that everything in the world could be explained in physical terms. And there's a term for that belief system called scientism. Now, this is not to say that science is wrong. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is science limits itself, and it's important to keep that distinction in mind. The people of Galileo's time limited themselves with their unwillingness to look beyond their belief system. And that's what he's saying is happening today in modern science. There's resistance to looking at theories that go beyond conventional understanding. And that's not so earth-shattering. It's kind of a typical story, really, in human history. Since the 17th century, I'm anticipating here, since the 17th century, that has been the dominant paradigm. And therefore, we end up here with our present existential threats. Like preceding religions, science is based dogmatically on an incomplete model of reality. It's not that they're wrong, it's that they're incomplete. They only see a narrow explanation, and there's resistance to seeing beyond that explanation. It was progress to wake up from a faith-based understanding and to question reflectively, to not be afraid to question. And even today, it's okay to question. It's okay to question scientific method. It's okay to ask, really, how did we get here? How did we arrive at this way of understanding? What if less thinking is greater than consciousness? In other words, don't just believe in your intellect. Most scientific discoveries are not made. This is so interesting to me. I love this part of this book. They can quantify that most scientific discoveries have not been made in linear, step-by-step scientific method. So what that's saying is most of the greatest scientific discoveries were not made by going into a laboratory and doing experiments and repeating experiments and step-by-step showing, boom, a discovery. It's not how it worked. They usually came from imagination or intuition. And now I have examples for you, and they're very interesting. In the 19th century, Mendeleev, who made the periodic table of the elements. And it is still today the basis of modern chemistry. And he was able to even predict gaps in the table that were elements that were missing in the chart because it hadn't been discovered yet. And he was able to predict them by their projected atomic mass and chemical properties. And he saw the entire thing one night in a dream. He didn't set out to invent a periodic table. He dreamt a periodic table. Does that give you the chills? I think that's fabulous. Because it's, let me tell you, as somebody who studied biology and chemistry in college, we had to memorize the periodic table. I couldn't tell you the first thing about it. And that's after having somebody else figure it out and spoon feed it to me. So it blows my mind that he came up with that from a dream. Then we have the example of the German chemist August Kekulé, I hope, from the 19th century as well. He dreamed of a ring-shaped molecular structure that was benzene after really struggling to try to figure it out intellectually in the daytime for a while. And one day he fell asleep, and while he was asleep, it came to him that, oh, okay, it's in the shape of a ring. And this provided an understanding of benzene that was crucial in industry, especially the petroleum industry. Then there's the example of Einstein, who at 16 imagined passing a beam of light, and from this imagining that he did, came the theory of special relativity. Don't ask me to explain it. And then there's Tesla, who used visualization to design his inventions. So he would just sort of sit and visualize, like, you know, manifesting and invent things. In modern times, a lot of apps are developed mostly because the guy who decides to develop an app is just imagining how he would fulfill his own needs. So he needed an app for some game or something. I don't know. I can't even tell you. But he would go, God, I wish I was able to do XYZ on the computer. There's an app for that now. How would I invent an app for that? And that's how apps came to be, people imagining. And the psychologist, Mihaly, oh my goodness, Csikszentmihalyi. I'm sorry, take my word for it. He defined the condition of the state of flow. This is a natural altered state of consciousness. Hyperfocus and energy. It's a hyperfocus and an energized state that athletes and creative types get when they're doing their best works. Going into the zone. Look at it like that. But monitoring shows the prefrontal cortex, which is the most evolved and complex thinking part of the brain, shuts down when they go into this zone of creativity or zone of physical performance. And it's referred to as a transient hypofrontality. So the part of your brain is designated for the highest form of intellectual thinking shuts down to allow the creativity to flow, the state of flow. You're in the zone. And it provides optimal well-being and optimal performance and optimal creativity. And it's not the result of having a smarter thinking brain. It's having the ability to tap into that flow. Some of the most important impactive scientific developments were the result of super enhanced imagination facilitated with the use of psychedelics. This is one of my favorite stories. In other words, some famous scientists made breakthroughs because they were on a trip. So they bypass brain processing networks, psychedelics do. And they're associated, these networks are associated with conventional perception and conventional thinking. And when you bypass them, you're able to tap into something more creative and imaginative. And you ask yourself, well, now, who would that be? scientist would do that? Yes. Francis Crick, the man who, with Dr. Watson, discovered the double helix form of the DNA molecule that explained how DNA was constructed. He used and advocated a variety of mind-expanding substances to come up with the notion of the double helix. They didn't just fool around with models of atoms until they figured it out. They took LSD and then won the Nobel Prize, P.S. Another Nobel Prize winner, Kary Mullis, revolutionized biology by discovering the polymerase chain reaction, which is used in genetic engineering. You hear about genetic PCR tests. That's what they're talking about. And he was a regular user of LSD. Steve Jobs, Apple, LSD. Silicon Valley engineers used in the past, still use, and enthusiastically advocate microdosing of LSD and mushrooms. And the author warns, look, he's not advocating anything here. We're not advocating this. I personally have never done LSD because my grasp on reality is tenuous enough. Let's just put it that way. But somebody very close to me was a hippie and did a lot and is one of the most reasonable, thoughtful, and sane people that I know. You don't know this person. You cannot extrapolate just by the knowledge that somebody was willing to do, what are they called? Somebody told me ethnogens. I think that's right. So the author says, look, he's not advocating anything. He says, please do not be careless. Don't play with fire. Know what you're doing. Have guidance and supervision. And don't get reckless and think this is all fun and games. Don't play with your brain. You don't play with your sense of reality. You can explore, but you have to be careful. He says you can deduce that less brain work is the equivalent of greater consciousness. That should tell you something about your brain. Reality isn't external. It comes from the inside out, but it doesn't come from the inside out. Imagination is the source of everything that we've developed. And there's a quote here. Now, see how interesting this book is and why I had a little bit of a hard time explaining what it was going to be about? Because I don't think I couldn't really fully explain it. What page am I reading? Okay. Although the content of consciousness depends in large measure on neuronal activity, brain cells, awareness itself does not. To me, it seems more and more reasonable to suggest that the mind may be a distinct and different essence. This is Wilder Penfield, neurosurgeon and groundbreaking researcher. And then we have, I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim in promissory materialism to account eventually for all of the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. In other words, you can't write off mystical experiences and transcendent experiences and spiritual experiences as the weird firing of brain cells. This belief must be classed as a superstition, thinking that it is just brain cells. We have to recognize that we are spiritual beings with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies and brains existing in a material world. And this is Sir John C. Eccles, neurophysiologist and Nobel laureate. Okay, chapter 4, Brain Science and Consciousness. The only thing that you can be certain of in your own personal conscious awareness is that you have this moment. This is the only thing you can be certain of, is your awareness of this moment. Modern neuroscience says that consciousness results from brain structure and function. This is the mainstream status quo belief. And they give as evidence of this tests in which they modify brain structure and brain function and observe any changes in awareness or behavior. But there is no evidence that the brain is the source of subjective consciousness. There is no concrete evidence. And this is called the hard problem. And the name comes from the philosopher David Chalmers. How does the material brain produce our experience of consciousness? That's the hard problem. The reversed view is asking it from a different direction. How does something as immaterial as consciousness arise from unconscious matter? Does the brain relate to our experience, but not to the source of the experience? That may be onto something. As an example, he says, look at your TV. Your TV show doesn't originate from inside the screen. The screen simply receives and displays whatever signals it's getting. It modifies them to make them visible. Like the TV show, to the TV, does consciousness come from our external source to the brain? So is it a receiver and a transmitter is the big question. And the rule that they say is most important to remember is that reception is not equal to generation. Generation being the creating. Is the brain a transducer, filtering, processing downloads? The brain can tune in to different types of awareness, and it can enable intentional uploads to consciousness. Then he cites psyche, the Greek spirit, who talks about the underlying soul or spirit. The Greek word psyche means the underlying soul. Ironically, psychology, the modern field of science, specialized to study the workings of our minds, became sidetracked from the source of the word. Consequently, psychology became degraded into a secondary soft science. As cleverly ridiculed by the American psychologist Robert S. Woodworth, quote, "First, psychology lost its soul, then its mind, and then its consciousness." Okay, let's see here. Psychiatry is dismissive of the deeper psychic, inner spiritual self, but hang on. But studies show the key critical factor for successful psychotherapy, above all else, is an empathetic connection, an empathetic connecting relationship between the client and the therapist. It has nothing to do with technique. What's paramount is that empathetic connection for healing. They've studied this. And we have here the bottom line, it's the relationship, not the technique. There was an unusually loud wake-up call from Dr. David Ross Marin of Harvard's prestigious Department of Psychiatry. He wrote an article June 15th, 2021 in Scientific American, and it's titled, "Psychiatry Needs to Get Right with God." It documents the research findings that support spirituality as a critically neglected aspect of proper mental health care. Now, not to extrapolate from that everybody needs to go to church to feel well. It's not what they're saying. They're saying we need to start trying to connect with our ephemeral spiritual self and the world around us. Not dogma, not institutions, that spiritual connection. Not the same thing as organized religion. Our reality, our senses, not the real world. Virtual vision is what it is. It's what our brains process into our subjective perception. This is just a couple of words thrown at you. They're really heavy, so I hope I'm not putting too much out there at one time. I don't want to go blow everybody's minds because it makes your head hurt, you know. So children, for example, who are born with cataracts, they're born not able to see. And when the cataracts are removed, the children still don't really see. They have to be taught what that information is that's coming through their eyeballs. It's not instinctive. You have to be taught. You have to be taught to see reality. We don't see things as we are. We see things as we're taught, as we learn to see them. Because of our personal histories, our processed brain reception, that leads to our reality, and we see the world through this personal lens. Everybody sees everything differently. We subconsciously filter information from different brain areas depending on our core beliefs. So they can actually study brains, and depending on what your core belief system is, different parts of your brain will fire with certain thoughts. This is confirmation bias. Therefore, in the margin I wrote MAGA. Let's see what this is about. Therefore, logic and facts are not enough to overcome emotionally conditioned ideological beliefs and prejudices. And this fits beautifully into my conversation that by the time you see this, I will have had with Jen Senko about brainwashing. This is why you can't just change people's minds with facts. Your reality is real to you, but it's an illusion to think that you're aware of all reality instead of just a narrow, processed bandwidth of it. And then there's the issue of the fact that thoughts become things. Consciousness can change the brain. That's a perfect example. That's a simple example. Neuroplasticity. How you think changes your brain. Children raised in a patriarchal family structure or with a rigid theocratic ideology, their brains will be structurally changed and will biochemically function differently than a brain of someone who does not have that background of rigid patriarchal authoritarian control. You can change how you think, and that can modify your habits, and you can gain insight through therapy, but it all goes hand in hand. You can't just hope you're going to change things in your life. You have to change your habits, change how you do things, change how you look at things, gain insight from somebody who can guide you through it, and that may change how you think. And it will physically rewire your brain. So you can't help somebody who's been raised in that kind of patriarchal authoritarian environment, but they have to actually participate in the change. I can't read my writing. Psychoneuroimmunology. This is your immunological system that fights off intruders in the body. The part of it in the brain having to do with the nervous system, which affects your psychology. This is how the mind functions in relationship with the immunological system and how they work on each other. This gives scientific validation to a lot of folk medicine, to the concept of placebos, and to spontaneous remissions. These are not as voodoo-ish as we were led to believe. There is concrete scientific explanation behind a lot of this stuff that we just weren't aware of. Epigenetics. Now this is interesting. We modify our genes to pass on to our offspring. Trauma is inherited genetically. The effects of trauma is passed on. The effects of trauma are passed on in the genes. Studies show that meditation can immediately affect gene expression. You may carry trauma in your genes, but it doesn't need to be expressed. You have 2 paired chromosomes, and maybe one of them is for the trauma, but you can override that by encouraging the expression of the other. In more than 100 genes of your metabolism and inflammation, genes that relate to running your metabolism and when things become inflamed and when they don't, those can be affected through meditation. So there are concrete studies that have been done that have shown this. This is mind over matter, is what this is. Additionally, there are experiences of non-ordinary states of expanded consciousness in deficient brain conditions such as hypoxia, that's not enough oxygen for normal brain function, savant syndrome, which is genius-like abilities emerging from damaged brain structures. We talked about that before, the guy who got hit on the head and suddenly was fluent in Chinese, you know. Near-death experiences, spiritual experiences with subsequent recovery, such as after resuscitation from cardiac arrest, and terminal lucidity, the experience of some cognitively impaired people becoming clear-headed just prior to death. And you can see that if you take care of the elderly who are dying and have dementia, they sometimes are able to carry on a conversation towards the end that's absolutely lucid. Studies with LSD and mushrooms, or as I put it here, shrooms, expand the consciousness and lead to transformative experiences, but they reduce blood flow to neural activity in key brain centers. So they're overriding certain parts of the brain, including the prefrontal cortex, where thinking comes from. It's the high-level executive thinking. They do affect what parts of the brain you're using. Once again, decreased intellectual brain function increases your consciousness. So we have two other physical brains. This is really interesting. In our heart and in our gut microbiome. The heart has its own internal nervous system, you know, the pacemaker of your heart, the sinus node, and it stores memories. And it's maybe why heart transplant people transfer donor personalities. So many stories since heart transplants have become a little more common. Somebody in the 50-year-old range with a bad heart will get the heart of an accident victim who's 18, an athlete who loves chocolate cookies and action movies. And suddenly this 50-year-old woman who had no interest in any of that after her heart transplant, suddenly into sports and loves chocolate chip cookies and action movies. And people are like, what? Or personality will be different. Somebody who was introverted and didn't like taking risks, has this heart transplant from some kind of adventurous person, and the next thing you know, the recipient is extroverted and likes to take risks. And the people that get together with the families of donors, like your child dies in an accident, you donate their organs, and eventually you're allowed to meet the recipients of the organs. They don't do this very often because you can imagine the psychological baggage that might go with this. But when they've done it, family members of the donors are shocked by how similar some of the words and thought processes of this recipient, how similar they are to the donor, the child that gave their heart or whatever. So personalities, interests can get transferred. You have more nerve endings from your heart to your brain, so going from your heart to your brain, than from your brain to your heart. So who's in charge? The heart generates its own electromagnetic field that's 60 times greater than that of the brain. The heart secretes as much oxytocin as the brain. This is the love bonding chemical. Oxytocin is what's released every time you nurse a baby, so you just love that baby. The heart has the key to accessing intuition. Studies were done at the Heart Math Institute. The heart is connected to a field that's not bound by space-time. So when people say, follow your heart, exactly. We can choose to be more heart-centered and shift awareness from our head to our chest. We can tune into the shifts in energy as thoughts and events occur. Listen to your heart. It's really important advice. Now, the gut biome, I love this part. The gut biome, you have trillions of bacteria in your large intestine. And they greatly outnumber the number of human cells in your large intestine and your total DNA. The bacteria in your gut greatly outnumber those. They're symbiotic. That means they're beneficial. They live off of us, but we benefit from them. So it's an agreement. They're beneficial. They help us to regulate physiological processes. For example, this is a mind blower. The myelination of the prefrontal cortex. This is the complex thinking part of the brain. And the bacteria in your gut help the synaptic growth for neuroplastic upgrading. So you have brain cells, and the dendrites look like the branches of a tree, and then the axon. And there are chemicals that are excreted on either end, and they transmit brain messages, and they happen lightning fast. You can never imagine how fast. It's how the nervous system works, basically. And they have a myelin sheath which protects them and helps to transmit. It's like a protein sheath or fatty sheet, I can't remember, and it helps to transmit messages. And these bacteria help to make those myelin sheaths and help that transmission of information. So if it weren't for the bacteria in your gut, your nervous system wouldn't work. And the bacteria secrete their own neurotransmitters. They secrete, now the bacteria that live inside you secrete serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. And these modify the brain. They modify thinking, mood, and memory. Your gut modifies your brain. How many times a day do I say, I felt it in my gut? Well, there we go. So, FYI, I wrote the SSRIs, the serotonin uptake, whatever's, I don't remember, inhibitors. These are antidepressants. They work on the serotonin in the brain. But good luck with that, because actually 90% of the serotonin in your body comes from the bacteria in your gut. So doctors are starting to experiment with the idea of using targeted probiotics in your gut instead of the SSRIs to enhance gut microbiome, and doing that with therapy seems to help depression. So go with your gut, right? You use your brain, but you're not your brain. You use your body, but you aren't your body. You're a whole lot more than that. What is reality? The more we look at it, the less real it seems. This is from the magazine The New Scientist, February of 2020. That was a watershed moment in human history, wasn't it? February of 2020. Okay, I'm going to end here because we're at the end of the chapter 4, and it's a convenient place to stop, and about an hour. So I'll be back with more of this book, and I hope you're enjoying it. I'm finding this book fascinating. I read it a few weeks ago, and you know, in one ear, out the other, because I'm always reading the next book. And so it's fun to revisit this. I really loved this book, and I spent a lot of time saying to my poor, long-suffering husband, listen to this. So I'm thrilled. Listen to this. This is very interesting stuff, and it changes our perspective, doesn't it? It changes our awareness. So I will be back. Thank you for watching. Slongafoil.